The Navy announces that Wake Island is probably captured by the enemy, and now it is disclosed that fewer than 400 Marines held Wake Island for at least 14 days against heavy Japanese attacks. The Marines had 12 fighter planes and a small quantity of weapons. They were commanded by a 38-year-old Marine Major, James P.S. Devereux. They sank 1 Japanese light cruiser and 3 destroyers. They held out against 13 raids.
Wake Island. 450 Marines' unbelievable stand against the Imperial Japanese Navy. During World War II, the Japanese military believed that the US Marines were recruited from prisons and insane asylums, which might have made sense given the Marines' ferocity in battle. But after the events on Wake Island, it's clear that the truth was far more remarkable. The first time the United States Marine Corps faced the Japanese military head-on was on a small coral atoll 2,000 miles west of Hawaii, closer to Japan than to America, making it a highly strategic location for both sides. At the time, Wake Island was held by 450 Marine Corps artillerymen, 1,200 civilian construction workers, and 70 Navy corpsmen. They were not heavily armed, with only 6 5-inch coastal artillery guns, taken from the original USS Texas from the 1800s, 12 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, 18 M2 Browning machine guns, 30 Browning .30 caliber machine guns, and 12 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters. In Wake Island's time zone, Pearl Harbor happened on December 8, 1941. An hour after the attack ended, Wake Island received a transmission warning them of the attack, advising them to be prepared. 2 hours later, 27 Japanese bombers attacked Wake Island, destroying 8 of their 12 F-4F Wildcats before they could even leave the ground. Despite the destruction, 400 civilian construction workers volunteered to help defend the island, and the Marines immediately began training them on how to operate machine guns and fortify positions. Wake Island was bombed again on December 9th, but on December 11th, 1941, an entire Japanese naval detachment arrived, signaling the start of the battle for Wake Island. Outmanned and outgunned, the defenders faced 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, 3 submarines, 1 submarine tender, 2 PT boats, and 2 amphibious landing ships carrying 450 Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, Japan's equivalent of the Marines. As the Japanese naval force advanced closer, they finally came within striking distance of the Marine artillery at 12,000 yards. Despite being well within their range, the Marines were ordered to hold their fire, a decision that puzzled them. These men were expert gunners who could hit targets at 12,000 yards with precision, but Major James Devereux, in charge of the Marines, recognized that the Japanese ships had superior range. The Japanese, not encountering any resistance, assumed that their earlier air raids had knocked out the island's defenses. As the Japanese fleet moved to within 4,000 yards, point-blank range for Marine artillery, Devereux finally gave the order to open fire. The Marines unleashed everything they had, catching the Japanese by surprise. In minutes, they managed to hit nearly all the enemy ships, sinking the destroyer Hayate after hitting its magazine. It took only 12 minutes for the Marines to sink Hayate, Japan's first naval loss in World War II, following its attacks on Pearl Harbor and 27 other Pacific locations. Panicked and unsure of what to do, the Japanese naval detachment retreated. It was then that they realized their grave mistake. They hadn't brought any aircraft carriers or planes to provide air support. Enter Henry Hammerin' Hank Elrod, one of America's first World War II heroes. Elrod and 3 other Grumman Wildcat pilots took off, realizing the Japanese ships had no air cover. They strafed the enemy decks with machine gun fire and dropped 100-pound bombs. Remarkably, Elrod managed to hit the depth charges on the deck of the destroyer Kisaragi, setting off a chain reaction that sank the ship. In the aftermath of the battle, the Marines surveyed the damage. They had lost 2 of their 4 remaining Wildcats, leaving them with only 2 operational planes. However, the Japanese had lost 2 destroyers, a submarine, and over 300 men, while the American side had only 5 wounded and no fatalities. Furious and humiliated, the Japanese launched an immediate air raid from the Marshall Islands, bombing Wake Island again. They continued bombing daily for the next 10 days. Despite these relentless attacks, the Japanese failed to inflict significant additional damage. Meanwhile, the story of the Marines' heroic defense began to spread across America, offering a glimmer of hope and a morale boost in the wake of the Pearl Harbor disaster. However, the victory was short-lived. Reinforcements for the Japanese were en route, drawn from their successful operations across the Pacific, including Pearl Harbor. The Japanese reinforcements arrived first, significantly outnumbering the defenders. The Marines desperately called for help, but high-level US government or military officials, not wanting to risk losing more ships, decided to abandon the island and its defenders. The Marines and civilian defenders knew they had been left to die, but they were determined to fight on. On December 22, 1941, the second battle for Wake Island began. This time, the Japanese brought overwhelming force: 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, 2 PT boats, 2 amphibious landing ships, a submarine tender, 2 submarines, 4 heavy cruisers, 2 mine layers, and 2 aircraft carriers fresh from Pearl Harbor. Surprisingly, the Japanese naval detachment kept their distance, unwilling to come within range of the Marines' artillery after their previous losses. Instead, they deployed their amphibious landing ships carrying 900 soldiers and sent out 50 planes from their carriers. The 2 remaining Marine Wildcats took off to meet the Japanese planes, shooting down 21 of them, including the bomber of Bombardier Noboru Kanai, who had been credited with sinking the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. Despite their heroics, the Japanese planes managed to knock out the island's communication lines, leaving Major Devereaux and his men without orders. The 900 Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces landed on the beach, but instead of retreating, the Marines fixed bayonets and charged. They met the Japanese in close combat, engaging them for 11 grueling hours. Despite the chaos, the Marines not only held their ground but launched counterattacks that fractured the Japanese lines, scattering their forces across the island. After hours of intense fighting, Major Devereaux emerged from his bunker, believing that the lack of communication meant his forces had been overrun. When he saw Japanese flags around the island, he assumed they had been victorious and began ordering his men to surrender. However, these were not victory flags. They were Japanese good luck flags, a tradition where soldiers carried flags signed by friends and family into battle. Unaware of this, Devereaux's surrender order came at a critical moment. The Japanese, adhering to the Bushido Code, were not inclined to take prisoners and planned to execute all the Americans. They stripped the Americans naked, tied them together with telephone wire, and marched them to the airfield, assembling machine guns for a mass execution. For 2 days, the Americans stood on the airstrip under the Pacific sun, waiting for their fate. Miraculously, the Japanese admiral announced that the emperor had decided to spare their lives. The American media had made such a big deal about the first defense of Wake Island that the entire world was watching. Knowing they couldn't commit a mass atrocity without international backlash, the Japanese decided to take the Americans as prisoners instead. The majority of the defenders were sent to POW camps in Japan or Japanese-occupied China. Most of them survived the war and returned home in 1945 and 1946. Upon their return, they discovered that Hollywood had turned the first Battle of Wake Island into a movie, released in 1942. The film, unaware of the second battle's outcome, depicted the defenders' demise. Years later, at a Wake Island reunion, a journalist asked the Marines what they thought of the movie when they returned home. One Marine, now in his 60s or 70s, quipped, "First of all, we didn't actually have a dog there," to the laughter of his comrades. It was a testament to the enduring spirit and humor of those who had lived through unimaginable circumstances. The story of Wake Island didn't end with the battle. The island remained under Japanese control for the rest of the war, subjected to regular air raids by American forces. In a twist of fate, one of those raids was the first combat mission for a new pilot, George Bush, who would later become the 41st President of the United States. For the Marines held in POW camps, their story took another unexpected turn. One Marine escaped, making his way to northern China, where he was taken in by Chinese communist soldiers. Their leader, Mao Zedong, personally ensured the Marines safe passage home, even gifting him Chinese rugs, a surreal connection between a US Marine and the future leader of Communist China. In conclusion, after the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese Navy's commander, Admiral Yamamoto, wrote in his diary, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." The first time Japan faced that terrible resolve was just 3 days later on Wake Island, where 450 Marines, 70 Navy corpsmen, and 400 civilian construction workers stood their ground and halted the most powerful navy in the world for 16 days.